Hello and welcome to the lecture video for Chapter 5 of COM375, Audience Response to Media, which deals with the appeal of destructive, intense, or graphic content. This covers Chapter 5 of your book and coincides with the lesson for this section. So without any further ado, let's go over what you read. And what you read was, get it to work, Chapter 5, which was titled Violence, Mayhem, and Horror. So these are three categories that are in a family of intense and potentially graphic content that is frequently featured in media. However, as the authors note, these are distinct. So let's first define the three. I'll refer to these as VMH in future, but it just refers to violence, mayhem, and horror. But they are all distinct from each other. So first, let's start with violence, which is essentially an action where a character is harming another character, generally deliberately. So think of here somebody shooting another person, punching another person, etc., where there is clearly an actor who is acting in aggression towards another student, or not another student, towards another character, and in the end, they are the person responsible for harm. Often this is purposefully. This would be frequently seen in action scenes, either by a protagonist or an antagonist who would be going after someone else. So the first thing that comes to mind for me would be The Matrix is wrought with violence because there are many fight scenes. In which the main character Neo will fight the main antagonist, Mr. Smith, and other characters. There is clear intent to harm the other in this case. Mayhem is an event which is associated with bodily harm, but is not necessarily caused by an actor. These would be things like natural disasters, car wrecks, explosions, destruction, etc., that can cause bodily harm, but are not necessarily caused by someone. A tornado, for instance, in the movie Twister, is not caught. We would call it an act of God. There's just no rhyme or reason to it. It's just weather happening, but it might harm somebody similarly to a violent act. Finally, horror can actually be an act of violence or mayhem, but there's an intent to create fear or terror for its audiences. These might also be suspenseful in some way, but in the end of the day, this is something that's supposed to frighten us in some way. Horror is a genre to itself. Think of Friday the 13th and the Halloween series, where there is a clear violent aggressor who sometimes will cause mayhem, but ultimately these actions are designed to create a sense of tension, anxiety, fear, and terror in the audience. So now that we've defined the three elements of VMH, let's watch this clip. I wanted to play that for a specific reason, and it's actually to illustrate some of the reasons that you might enjoy VMH in the moment. Think about the different elements of each of those. These are all a family of different stadium destructions. They're very similar in many ways, but as you were watching, and feel free to admit that yourself to this, as is noted in the book, this is something that isn't rare among people. It's a naturally occurring phenomena that applies to many. But there are many elements of this that might just be naturally enjoyable to watch in the moment, and thus might explain why audiences are attracted to VMH overall. There was some sense of overall there was probably some aesthetic pleasure here. Some sensory stimulation for each of the stadium destructions. Each was also in a family of different things. However, so each was essentially very similar. These are all just major stadiums that are being demolished because they're being old and they are done in a similar fashion. However, at the end of the day, there's also a lot of uniqueness to each of the explosions themselves. They all kind of went down in different ways, and some were destroyed from the inside and others went side to side, etc. And also this is something that is out of the ordinary as well. It's something that you don't see every day, correct? This is a big building that is being destroyed, and these are all some of the reasons that are named by the authors of the chapter for some of the reasons that VMH might be pleasurable to watch. Violent and destructive acts might actually just be naturally pleasurable to watch. The authors cited some work in aesthetics that didn't necessarily have a lot of support empirically, but were theorized that sensory and aesthetic appeal, so essentially because of the sound, sights, etc. of destruction, and also just the general composition, such as the novelty, the unpredictability, the tension of how something is going to happen, might just be naturally visually pleasing, or just a pleasing experience. There were some cited works that coincided with limbic activity when seeing violent, destructive acts. And the limbic system is an area of the brain that is associated with pleasure. So this might just be something that is naturally and inherently pleasurable for humans. It might be just unique and fun to see a little bit of destruction for some people. There were also some citations for different individual traits that are different among people that might explain why VMH is pleasurable to watch in the moment, not despite of something else. There were also some individual differences that were cited by the authors that might explain why VMH is pleasurable in the moment as opposed to despite its presence or after the fact. Novelty and sensation seeking were the two main factors. Novelty seeking is a need for new experiences, and sensation seeking is a need for arousing experiences. These are often studied in the field of social science as differences among people, that some people do not want novelty, they want the same over and over again, but others have a desire to see new things rather than experience similar things over time. Sensation seekers are your daredevils. These are your friends in high school that might have been skating, the people right now who are skydiving, and they need some sort of arousing experience that gets their heart pumping. Often people who are high in both of these traits, novelty seeking and sensation seeking, are more likely to experience arousal and select and ultimately enjoy VMH in the moment in media experiences. There were also some other explanations for why VMH could be pleasurable in the moment that were more theoretical. The first is disposition theory, which again you have heard at this point. It relates to Zillman's affective disposition theory and states that we like seeing good characters punish bad characters. So we covered this when we were talking about horror and drama, but part of the appeal of a drama overall is the fact that we like seeing good characters succeed and bad characters fail. The people that we like, we want them to do well, and the people that we don't, we want them to do poorly. So, in the case of violence, mayhem, and horror, if a good character is the person punishing a bad character, we might approve of the approbation that they deliver to that character. So, in the case where Neo punches Mr. Smith in the face in The Matrix, we might actually derive enjoyment because Neo, our liked character, is the reason that Mr. Smith, our disliked character, is failing, and thus due to disposition theories, and thus based on disposition theories' main tenets, this would explain audience enjoyment. However, the punishment needs to be ultimately appropriate. They mentioned that if the punishment is too high or too low, we might discount in the case that a punishment is too small, or change our disposition towards characters if a punishment is too severe. So one example that you could have is, think if your friend or even if your enemy dropped a plate and you proceeded to subject them to torture, and this was filmed. Even if in this case you were the protagonist in the little film that is your life, that doesn't seem like a very appropriate punishment for you, and thus the audience who is watching might ultimately change their disposition towards you, and you might not be as liked as before. In contrast to the disposition theory logic for the appeal of VMH, social norm violation might also be an explanation for why narratives that feature VMH are so appealing. Essentially, social norms are what we generally perceive that other people do and what they approve of. So think of, do most other people smoke? That would be your perceived social norm for smoking. And in the case of VMH, as was mentioned earlier, these are kind of rare. So the violation of some of our social norms, because violent acts, mayhem, horror is so out of the ordinary, we might actually enjoy the fact that something is going on that's out of the ordinary. Most people don't generally perform of or approve acts of violence, so perhaps seeing them on screen might be in some way appealing in the moment. Thus, according to this theoretical explanation for the appeal of VMH, seeing somebody break expectations is actually a pleasurable act. In this case, it would actually contradict disposition theory, because all cases of VMH would always be pleasurable. According to disposition theory, if a bad character punished a good character, that would not be enjoyable. And if a good character punished a bad character too severely, that would also not be enjoyable. But the social norms perspective would say that all these acts are enjoyable because they are always a violation of our expectations of what others do. So these are differing theories about the how violent acts are perceived. Now, empirically, so this is in studies that have actual experiments associated with them, disposition theory actually has more support. People generally like VMH when it coincides with their dispositional expectations for a narrative. So seeing an appropriate act of violence toward a disliked character from a good character generally might lead to the enjoyment of VMH. Other people, as mentioned by the authors, might actually enjoy a narrative that features VMH despite the fact that there are moments of VMH. So this would be the case where in the moment, violent acts are not necessarily enjoyed. However, despite this fact, they might enjoy the overall experience and thus tolerate and be drawn to plots with VMH. In the textbook, the example is one of the authors who went and really enjoyed Pulp Fiction, which features a lot of violence in the form of physical and gun-related violence, as well as sexual violence and general mayhem as well, and some terror and horror as plot elements. And the author said that they didn't like it, essentially, when that was happening, but the overall quality of the film and the story that it told led her or him or her to like that film. So some explanations more specifically of this are that perhaps dealing with VMH and more specifically horror might be a mastery experience, and this is something that we deal with. We have the ability to overcome. We might other mastery experiences might be building something for yourself or completing a paper and getting a good grade. The fact that you've done something might actually enjoy it, even though the act of doing it might not be so enjoyable in itself. So think about horror and why it does pretty well in theaters and continues to get releases. These are big date movies, actually. Rom-coms and horrors are generally seen as date flicks. And the authors note that perhaps this is a mastery experience, especially for men, because if they are able to withstand such horror, they can be seen as the protectors to the opposite sex in women. Now, I'm just going to point out the fact that this does not necessarily apply to just men. In fact, I am a horrible, I'll just use myself as an example. I really don't enjoy horror, and I am very easily scared. However, I would definitely appreciate if I was taken to a film by a lovely lady and she was able to protect me, and perhaps she got some sort of enjoyment by protecting me from the harm of whatever horror slasher du jour that I'm watching on screen. And perhaps that is really what gives her some sort of pleasure, despite the fact that she doesn't really like these scenes. Some of the evidence that is pointed out that mastery experience might actually explain the pleasure that comes with seeing a VMH plot, despite the fact that scenes are not particularly enjoyable, came from some studies of children who were exposed to horror plots, who noted recollection and attributed their recollection of some of the horror scenes that they experienced to sleep problems and anxiety, despite the fact that when they were exposed to these scenes again, they exhibited less horror-related issues, and generally it can translate over into the real world. So experiencing fear might actually prevent us from experiencing fear again. So this shows some sort of suspension of disbelief in the moment, so saying it's not real, etc., that really these scenes are quite disturbing, but in the moment we might overcome for various reasons. Another explanation here is disposition theory, which again, despite the fact that you might not like a violent act, because a good character is performing it, it fits into the overall narrative. It's a very brief explanation, but disposition theory might actually explain why VMH is pleasurable in the moment, but also why people might enjoy VMH plots despite the fact that they don't like scenes that feature it. There are also certain theories that would say that the appeal of plots with VMH comes from what happens after. So this might not be despite or during the fact, but there might be a sense of pleasure that comes after VMH. So the catharsis explanation will rear its head again. Angry people or people with high arousal might have an opportunity to explain, to show aggression or experience aggressive behavior by watching it on screen appropriately rather than committing these acts. However, there may be some issues here. Some results showed that angry people were actually more likely to be aggressive after watching a VMH film. So this might occur from time to time, but support is varied and inconsistent. There was also the issue of desensitization, which I mentioned a little bit when talking about mastery experiences. This is the notion that media exposure will reduce real fear after the fact. So for horror, for instance, experiencing a horror or slasher film might lead us to be less scared of events over time. So this is why there are generally a few very mildly horror-inducing scenes that are designed to get a little bit of fear and terror in even children's films. I remember specifically I went a little bit too far when watching James and the Giant Peach, because there's a large cloud that almost destroys the peach and all the people that I liked. But experiencing that might make me less scared of things that I shouldn't be scared of as a child, like clouds or rain or weather in general. However, it should also be noted that one thing that was not discussed is that there's generally a big issue in society about talking about how media affects its audiences on the whole, and on the individual level and societal level. This has been an issue since the 20s and the 50s, which were primarily concerned with sexual content in Nickelodeon's theaters. and also comic books, violence effects that actually spur national panic, but even rears its head today and more recently when you look at some of the outcry that comes with video games, specifically violent video games, on audiences. There are some theories that would say that exposure to violent and mayhem-related behavior might actually make these things more acceptable in public because it desensitizes them. However, I would like to say that I would like to offer a caveat that while media do affect audiences, there is no magic needle, and this is something that is long disproved and has had many studies that contradict the magic needle or the direct effects model that would say that media have a powerful influence over people. Just because people are playing violent video games does not necessarily mean that they are more likely to commit a violent act. I am not saying, however, that the playing of these games does not affect the way that they interact in the world and their perceptions. However, we need to be careful when talking about media so as not to overstep our bounds in terms of its effect. Remember, media is naturally mediated, which means that it is going to have dampened effects on its audiences. Not that the effects are insignificant, but it's not like seeing a violent act on screen is going to lead a child or anyone else to go and replicate this in pretty much any case. And if cases do arise, they are extremely rare. Another explanation for why VMH might be appealing after the fact is that fear and arousal jag, which is something we've talked about before, is essentially happens on an intensity, a sliding scale of intensity. So as we experience more fear or more arousal and things are really, really exciting and intense, which VMH is generally extremely arousal inducing, exciting, and in the case of horror, fear and terror is something that is experienced in high amounts to the point that people will cry during horror films, and I speak from experience there. I hate to say it. So actually, after experiencing these high amounts and these high arousing emotions and excitation, we actually should experience more relief as well. And according to excitation transfer, this extreme arousal jag is more enjoyable by nature. So the fact that we experience more relief might be a pleasurable state after the fact. So regardless if we liked it or not in the moment, the fact that we experienced an intense amount of fear might be more enjoyable because of the release we experience after. I'd also like to think about some discussion. I talked about some of the negative effects on viewers in the previous slide, and I would ask you to ask yourself that question about how you feel about media overall, your own media use, and what its effects are on you. Again, I don't want to say that media use will not affect the psychology of an individual. It certainly does. However, we need to be careful when we talk about this. There have been many moral panics that have been extremely detrimental because of outcry over seemingly negative media effects related to violence, mayhem, and horror that are ultimately driven by single instances that do not represent media effects on the whole. So think critically. I would challenge you to think critically about the presence of VMH in media today, and whether or not that is negative at all, and if it is, how it is, and how it could potentially be. The presence of violence, media, mayhem, and horror is something that has been around since the Romans were watching gladiator fights and more. So this is something that you should ask yourself. There was also a mention of confounds in the appeal of VMH content. So one issue with trying to study many media effects is the fact that there might be something else explaining the appeal. And in the case of VMH content, think about the different explanations that might actually really be why we enjoy VMH on the whole. Some things that were mentioned in the textbook were the quality of the program. The Matrix is legitimately a good movie, as is Pulp Fiction. These are well-written, well-acted, good, high-quality cinematography films, and the presence of VMH might not actually be the reason that people like them. So they're not necessarily going out to see a violent film or one that invokes mayhem. They want to see a good film. So think about movies, the difference between maybe a Battleship of recent days and a Mad Max Fury Road. Battleship was panned. It's full of mayhem and violence, but it was panned and generally less appealing than Mad Max, which is equally crazy and violent, but people held that that was a higher quality film, and that might explain the appeal. Another issue that was brought up is that there is frequently sexual content in horror films and violence and mayhem films. So this might actually be part of the explanation for why audiences seek this out. I'm not going to get into why at all, but I think you would be lying to yourself if you thought that sexual content in a film wasn't naturally appealing to you. It's part of our evolution. Another issue that was brought up specifically about horror content is that horror narratives might actually be related to suspense, and thus some of the explanations for suspense that we read about earlier might really be driving the appeal of horror overall. So with that, here's our references. As always, I would encourage you to go out and do the quizzes, reread your content, and make sure that you are carefully reading, and also post on the discussion board about the issue of VMH in the discussion that I tried to prompt in the previous slide, and I apologize for the typo in the title. So without any further ado, if you have questions, feel free to email me, and I'll see you next week.